I was part of the Boston Faith and Justice Network from the beginning, and I no longer live in Boston, but I count myself as one of the fans of the network and of yours, Elizabeth. And just thank you so much for your work, and I love seeing all the good work you've done over the years. So I currently live in Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. I am a resident fellow at a place called the Center for Public Justice, which is a Christian policy and civic engagement organization. And at CPJ, I do honestly something quite similar to what BFJN does, what I cared about then and have done since, which is look at public policy from a Christian standpoint. And in particular, think about ways to build coalition and common ground, sometimes between the different segments of Christianity in the US, sometimes between people of faith and no faith. But I'm really, I feel really called to those places where our differences could make us weaker, but that possibility of shared learning, growth, and God's Spirit working through our differences presents us with a lot of possibility. So I care a lot about that. And a big issue that I've worked on for the past several years has been the kind of what kind of supports can support benefit families in the US. So the project that I work on is called Families Valued. And we think about how to build healthy workplaces for those who are in families, how to advocate for policies that support family life, while also honoring God's good intentions for work as well as family. So I kind of connect to this issue in that way, and am just kind of valuing as a Christian, even though they're hard, the potential value of having difficult conversations and the trust that God's Spirit is with us in those conversations.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And like I said, I'm so grateful that you're having this conversation with us. And I think we'll just start kind of diving in and hopefully cover some of the stuff that we talked about, because there's definitely some ways in which you have framed this issue that have really helped me to think about it. Because as I shared before, we've had this uncomfortable conversation series going for almost 2 years now. And even though the topics are difficult and sometimes like hard to wrap our minds around, for me, they've been really engaging and they don't genuinely make me uncomfortable, although I recognize that they do for a lot of people. But this is a topic that I am uncomfortable about. And I feel like as I've tried to have conversations with people, that's not uncommon, particularly for Christians trying to frame this, because this seems to be a topic that once you articulate even a question or an idea or a candidate that you're for, this issue is like a litmus test where it's like, oh, okay, that means you're on our team, you're not on our team. Or sometimes there are deeper moral implications that people apply to a position on abortion, which I don't even want to call these positions because this is such a fraught issue or a nuanced issue. So all that to say, the way I came to this issue, thinking about it differently. I was raised one way and that there's one way to think and that's it. But as I encountered different policies, different education, different people with different experiences, I started to, I think, develop a little bit more of a nuanced view. But as I continue to learn, I just think there's so much in the theology area, the policy, and the different ways that we as Christians interact with it. So I'm just interested to hear from your perspective, whatever you will share or comfortable sharing, how have you interacted with this topic, either professionally or in your faith life, that either has evolved or changed, or ways in which you found it helpful to talk about it, if that makes sense. That was like a long, convoluted way to say, I find this difficult. Help me.
All right. So I'll start in a couple ways, and I will kind of connect to this work I've done around family, because it's sort of the connective tissue. So, maybe starting out like you, I was raised very much around kind of the Christian pro-life community, within the Christian pro-life community, and with the Christian pro-life ethic. And I think that within Christian teaching, there's an ethic of peace that does really call us to value life in all of its stages. And so that's kind of one frame. And then the next frame that I've come to it is actually as a mother, which is actually the same route by which I came to be thinking about family and pro-family policy, which was really to say, I was taken by surprise by becoming a mother. Really all aspects of it. I was taken by surprise with, on the one hand, how hard pregnancy and motherhood was, and now motherhood is and can be. I was taken by surprise about how beautiful it is. And this kind of unique interconnection that a parent has with a child, and in particular, a pregnant mother with a child, and sometimes kind of a new mother and birthing mother. And likewise, there's a very kind of unique bond, even a biological bond that fathers and adoptive parents build with a child as they raise him or her. So when it all happened to me, and it's like everybody says this when it happens to them, like it kind of bowled me over, and I was like, this is an amazing part of life. And it's my third realization is sometimes this part of life gets kind of set aside. It gets kind of like, not acknowledged. And for me, it wasn't getting acknowledged or supported well enough in the workplace or in some of the choices that were available to my husband and I as we started the journey towards parenthood, which would kind of open up a whole new set of questions for me about, well, what kind of pro-family values culture are we living in when something that's so important ends up kind of so secondary in some of our principal institutions. So those are some of my ways in. Maybe we can talk more a little bit though about the things that kind of get put on this conversation. And I think a lot of that is, as you said, the kind of the choosing of teams or the identifying of sides based on ultimately kind of how you think about this as an issue for our political community. And I think that's actually really concerning, and it's something that we should name and kind of think through, because it makes it harder to work through all those other things that we need to think about, which are all themselves important and beautiful and sometimes hard. But on top of that, we're often told that if someone doesn't think like us, they're not only like not thinking like us, but they're somehow, less good, even in some of the rhetoric these days, less human. And I think that's really, really, really concerning.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I appreciate a number of the things that you pulled out there, but that last piece and what that says about each other when we label pro-life, pro-choice, something in between. You're generally not allowed to be something in between, and maybe that's part of the problem. Yeah. Or even defining terms like what one team decides that means about the other team. Again, yes. Using the language of teams very intentionally. Yeah. And I just think that's problematic, especially, for our country generally, but I think especially for us within faith communities. This seems to be one of a few issues that we don't seem able to speak about in a way that I'm always telling my kids, you can always be kind and gentle, like you can believe what you believe really deeply, but can we interact kindly and gently? And I think this is not an issue where kindness and gentleness seem to enter the conversation. But I also really appreciate what you pulled out, and I just want to follow up on the motherhood and the way that illuminated things for you, because that very much resonates. The unbelievable difficulty that it was like, why didn't anyone explain this to me? Like how hard this is. Yes. But alongside it with the joy, but there's just a profoundness to it, which I think you were touching at. And so are there ways in which, because you talked a little bit about, I think in the Holy Post when you were on there, I think this is where my knowledge comes from, about medical leave and not having access to that, family medical leave, maternity leave. And I had the same experience with both of my kids. I did not have maternity leave for either of them. I worked for small law firms at the time, and it just wasn't an option. And when I think about the privilege that allowed me to still I mean, I stayed home for 6 weeks, but then I went back to work, but that was still a privilege when we think about some women having to return, within a week or 2 weeks of giving birth. I can't imagine. And so can you talk a little bit about your experience? And I know we're kind of backing into the abortion conversation, but maternity leave and all of these policies that could surround and support women are very much connected. I think that's pretty self-evident. So can you talk a little bit about your experience there and how that has or has not, informed the way you view this policy-wise and what we could and should be doing?
Absolutely. So my experience when I had my 2 children was that I did have access to some parental leave, thankfully. I think I was able to piece together 12 weeks, and the piecing together is a kind of a common experience for a lot of women, where maybe there's a sick leave, there's a short-term disability policy at your workplace, maybe there's some formal leave, but ultimately I was able to take off 12 weeks. And as I was in the middle of those 12 weeks, it really wasn't even until week 10 with my firstborn child that I felt anywhere close to competent to care for him, that I was anywhere near like a regular feeding and sleeping cycle, right? So at the time I was like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that so many moms are asked to go back to work before this point, because even just the physical bonding, the physical healing, for mothers that nurse, the kind of learning to nurse can just take so much time. Not to mention the lack of sleep, which makes it very difficult to do other things. So it was a wake-up call to me, and I began to kind of learn, as many of us have and know, that in the United States, paid parental leave is not a guarantee. It is based solely on what's available from your employer. Many workers do have a job protection for the first 12 weeks after a child is born. Many workers have that protection, but they have no guarantee of pay. So that sets the United States apart from pretty much every other industrialized nation. And it does mean that for anyone whose employer doesn't have a program, doesn't have a way of funding leave, that you're going to have to decide if you're going to lose out on income or and take care of your child or go back to work. About 20% of women in the United States have to go back to work within a few weeks of giving birth. So again, it's just an amazing kind of truncating of this really important part of human development. The other thing that affected us more directly, and this was in a different era with respect to the law, but my husband and I had to be very cautious about when we started having children, because at the time that we first had children, it wasn't a given that health insurance would cover a child born within your first year of employment or within your first year of health insurance coverage. That has been subsequently changed by the essentially Obamacare law, but again, it's as if pregnancy and childbirth is like an afterthought rather than kind of a core part of human life. And so I think that's something we should really think about. And I do think it's really connected to what's at stake with abortion, because by honoring that pregnancy and the time after a child is born, not only does it make it possible for more women to carry a child to term and to care for their own child, but it really makes clear that this part of human life is honored. It is an important part of human life. It's distinct and it has its own distinct challenges, but it's not something other or different that we should kind of set to the side.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful in thinking about, additionally, like our very broken healthcare system being another obstacle as we try to consider abortion. Obviously, yes, you made that connection very well. And just to make it explicit, like these are policies that, because we have so little that supports, pregnant women giving birth and early childhood as a nation, that affects women's choice of whether or not to continue the pregnancy. Because again, some of us who are in positions of privilege, and again, like I was able to take 6 weeks off of work knowing my job would still be there. unpaid, but like there still was privilege wrapped in that, and it wouldn't have been something that I would have been worried about. Like we could save up for that and be okay. But for us to understand that that's not the situation for so many women.
Absolutely.
And so what do policies look like that kind of have that support, and why? And I don't know if this is an answerable question, but why does it seem like people who wear the pro-life label are the people who advocate, sometimes actively or at least passively, aren't involved in some of these policies, particularly, the constant trying and failing for family medical leave on a national level, but also healthcare reform?
Yes. And I would say that kind of one of the urgent needs around healthcare right now is to ensure that all mothers and children are covered for the full year after pregnancy and childbirth, and really even pregnancy, regardless of what happens, because there are so many health needs in that first year. There's so many potential points of complication. So in some states, Medicaid, which is kind of the publicly available healthcare, is guaranteed for that first year, but that's been at each state's option, and it isn't covered everywhere. So that would be an enormous gap to fill for moms who are worried about bringing a child into the world, and understandably worried about their own health too. So yeah, why haven't we? I think that's it's really complicated, right? We've mixed up the kind of public supports that I think can make universal support possible and support for the most vulnerable. We sort of mixed that up into a whole other set of conversations around deservingness, undeservingness in some instances, about kind of the market or not the market, when really we are there is a real need, and private market employers have not been able to step in and fill the need for complete healthcare for all mothers and young children, nor for parental leave. So I think we really need to think about that as part of what some call it like a whole life package.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And I think you've touched on this a little bit, but thinking about the role of government, right? And I think that gets at some of these differences between the camps of people who identify one way or another way, and what is the role of government and wanting minimal government. Although again, if you point to some other things, it seems an inconsistent ethic all around. But because I think about, so my husband runs a small business. He's a mechanic, an auto repair shop. Best thing to have in your family, just by the way, as a mechanic.
Yeah.
So there are about 12 to 15 employees, depending on the season and whatever. And for them, if they don't have very many women working there, but they have some, and to have to pay an employee to not be there for, say, 12 weeks, like that would be crippling for a small business. So as much as, pure market economists and people who are just, capitalism all the way 100% might just want the private sector to work this out. From a practical standpoint, my own little personal anecdotal experience, it's just not possible. So thinking about that, this is one of those policies that we know the data really tells us that medical leave and healthcare, these are two things that could reduce abortions if this is our goal. How do we help frame those conversations differently, I guess? Do you have any insights there?
And I'd be interested to hear what your husband's experience has been, because in Massachusetts, you're one of the states that has now established a statewide paid family and medical leave program. And the idea is that employers and employees, I think, can pay in just a small amount from their payroll into this fund, and then employees can access that fund directly when they have need. And so it actually should alleviate some of the burden for the employer to have to manage every single leave. Then what remains on the employer's plate is figuring out how to cover workflow while somebody is gone, which is what they would have to do anyway if somebody takes time off without pay. But the pay piece is covered through this public program. So I do think we should talk about it as a way that the public sector can actually collaborate with the private sector to make workplaces better, to make them more humane and more accessible to everybody. Yeah, I think that should be one way to do it. We actually surveyed faith-based employers and found that um, you know, in our among our interviewees, everybody had a kind of strong attachment to pro-family values in the workplace. They cared deeply about their employees. And when it came time to asking, do you provide paid family and medical leave? What does it look like for women and men who have children while they're on staff? They could really only provide about 6 weeks max, or I should say 6 weeks on average. And that's using all kind of forms of benefit. What made the difference when we looked at our whole sample is employers that were in states that had some of these pro-family laws, like a paid family leave program on the books, and they were actually able to provide more. So through those programs, they're better able to effectuate their own values.
Yeah, okay, that's great to think about. And yeah, thinking about the Massachusetts policy and other states who might be doing that, I like that collaborative thought. It doesn't, like, so much in what how we're trying to frame this, it's not necessarily an all or nothing, although you could still advocate for full government control and involvement. Faithful minds can differ, but there are other ways to do that. That's great to know. And I love when people are innovating and being creative about solutions, because it allows us to consider it's not this way or that way, that there's other ways to do that. Thinking about the family, as you were talking about, like these faith-based organizations that are, pro-family values. And I feel like sometimes that phrase is almost super fraught now, but like when we're thinking about it as its actual meaning, like valuing the family, you've talked a little bit about that, about what it means, how we view family and how that can affect what we do and what we think the family is for. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that intersects with abortion generally, but also just kind of some of these family value ideas that we've been talking about?
Yeah. There are a couple of verses that come to mind when I think about the family. I think about in the Psalms, the psalmist talking about God placing the lonely in families. This beautiful image of connection and even healing and repair that can come through families. And then my other favorite image from the Bible really is of Jesus at the wedding at Cana, because here's like Jesus in his first public, what we now think of as his first public miracle. And it has all these funny layers to it because it's, at the request of his mother, it's at a wedding, which is by definition the formation of a family. And in his instance, it's a communal event. And his act there is to turn water into wine, does a couple of things. It saves kind of the honor of the family who's throwing the party, the wedding, so that they have enough wine for all the guests. It enables the celebration to continue. And celebrations in those days were known to, around a wedding, would include immediate family, but my understanding is they would also include kind of neighbors and the whole community. And so that celebration is drawing in lots of other people, and he's honoring his mother in that act. So I think it should signal to us, or it signals to me, family as a place of joy and celebration, as well as a place of welcome. So it is not about like circling the wagons, defining who's in and who's out, but about bringing people in and about hospitality. And I do think as Christians, if we think about family and family policy that way, it really shifts our perspective. I think the reason that we see family values as a catchphrase as potentially troubling is because it actually has been used to define who's in and who's out, right? Who's on our side and who's not, who isn't the right kind of family. And that, I think that isn't consistent with our faith. But one where we're kind of drawing people in. In Catholic social teaching, there's actually a much clearer account of this, where the idea really is that the health of the family is kind of for the sake of mission, for the sake of the world. So, as parents, you raise children with values and virtues, but it's always for the purpose of this kind of outward motion and outward care.
And that's such a helpful way to frame it, thinking about outward from the family perspective and the community perspective. Like this is what it's for, not for our own good alone, or that whole blessed to be a blessing thing. I feel like I
Right.
learned in Sunday
Right.
school.
Yeah, I know. Or even as a
So-
justification to be selfish about what you have, right? I mean, yes, we provide for our families and we're looking out for them, but shouldn't be used as justification to, to hoard resources, to hoard privileges.
Yeah, I think that's a great reminder just for a general way in which we conceptualize families and our communities and all of these things. Like it's wonderful that to have them and to treasure them, but ultimately we are all God's people, right? And so what does that mean for each hat we wear, and for each community that we're a part of? So I think that's really helpful for a lot of things, but particularly for framing this discussion. So thinking about kind of what you do and this policy piece, can you kind of identify, we've been kind of talking about it a little bit, but like what policies exist or we want to come into existence to make abortion less common? Because it's, again, we're not here to be like, here's the actual Christian view on abortion. We're trying to have understanding that this is a nuanced issue. But I think as believers, I think you kind of touched on this at the beginning, like we do have this value of life. And again, we're not going to get into in this particular conversation when life begins, because that is a whole conversation, but valuing life, it can dictate like, okay, what policies, if this is our goal is to make abortions rare, and whether or not so we're going to set aside like abortion legislation. Other than that, what are some of the policies that exist now on a national level? Are there any that are helpful, and what is there, in the ones that you think we need, is there anything happening? Any hope on that?
So, I talked about paid parental leave. I'm also, very supportive of paid parental and family leave, because obviously caregiving doesn't end, and it isn't only attached to pregnancy and childbirth. Pregnancy and childbirth is a great example of something that happens throughout the life course and for a lot of different people. So regardless of whether or not they have children. So paid parental and family leave is really critical. I can circle back to that and share a bit of what's happening or could happen there. I mentioned already the need for maternal and child health care, especially a focus on the first full year for women and children. And that I believe is happening mostly state by state. So I'm going to guess that Massachusetts is a state that's already provided that, but kind of keeping an eye on other states is important, and keeping an eye on there are some pieces of legislation that would try to fill in those gaps as well at the federal level. Another piece that could actually move at the federal level is called the Pregnant Worker Fairness Act. And that's a law that would strengthen the protections for workplace accommodations for pregnant women. So for example, if you're pregnant and you're working in a physically taxing job and you need additional breaks during your pregnancy, or you need to take a light duty so that you're sitting rather than standing or lifting things, it's been applied through other federal laws, but there have been a lot of gaps and kind of a refusal by the courts to really honor pregnancy as a distinct condition that needs this kind of support. So the Pregnant Worker Fairness Act actually has bipartisan support. So it's been passed through the House of Representatives on a bipartisan vote, and it's potentially coming up for a vote in the Senate. So that would be something to really keep our eye on, and would be a great way to move folks together, not just, kind of on partisan lines, but Republicans and Democrats alike. And then finally, I think we should all be thinking a lot about childcare. I mean, I think a lot of us are. Childcare is very hard to find. It can be expensive. It's really major expense for young families and new families. And there are a number of ways to think about improving the funding available to childcare. And I think it's also really important to think about the work itself and the quality of jobs for those who are providing childcare to families. So that's often overlooked, but it's hard work, and kind of for some of the same reasons that we sometimes disregard family in our culture, I think we sometimes undervalue those who work in caregiving jobs.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. That's definitely something we hadn't quite touched on yet, is the childcare issue. And again, thinking about all of these things is just a way to frame like what goes into this, what goes into becoming a parent, right? And thinking about all of the ways in which we do and do not support people who might be making a choice around that. And what does that say about what we value, really? And I think childcare is such a great example. Again, thinking of my own, like when I had kids, I was fortunate enough to have family that could watch my daughter and then daughters. But if we had to put them in childcare, I'm sure it's not unusual, like in Massachusetts, it's just an incredibly expensive, and as you said, hard to find. I always see on the little moms board in my town, does anyone know of any openings? Because it's just, they seem to be less and less available, but the expense, it would have been more than I was making at the time if we had to put our children in childcare. And so again, recognizing the privilege I had that maybe has made me not consider that as much until I started wrestling with this issue in different ways. So again, just a caution to all of us, like our experience is so valuable, and it's important to bring our perspectives, but also to be in conversation with people with different experiences to understand that there's challenges that we might not have had to face, or challenges we did face that we can share. So that's really helpful. And then, so I just want to circle us back to, again, we keep kind of touching on things and then going deep on one thing. And then I'm like, okay, I don't want to forget that other thing. But as we think about our faith communities that we're a part of, that we've seen, that we read and learn about, what do you see as being done well around this conversation? Like, this is where I'm encouraged to be part of faith communities, and I see Christians engaging in ways that like honor Jesus. And then maybe where do you see that that's not happening? And I don't mean specific like this church, that church, I think, like, I just mean like what's being done well in faith communities around this issue, and where are we maybe not honoring our call to do justice and kind of be Jesus in the world.
Yeah. I'll give a couple of positive examples. One is, in my time working in the Families Valued Project, I've come across Christian employers who really have walked the walk, walked the talk. There's one that I think of, their candy maker based in Pennsylvania that was started as a social enterprise to hire immigrant mothers, in particular immigrant workers here in the US, I think particularly those with refugee status. And they knew that their workforce then would largely be parents, and they developed their workplace policies accordingly. They thought about how any parent is going to have to take time off for doctor's appointments and school appointments and all that, all those sorts of things. And so they built it in from the beginning rather than thinking of it as an afterthought. So I think that's a great example of where Christians can lead, and I think churches should support their members who are inclined towards social enterprise in that way. And I don't think you have to be an explicitly social enterprise business to implement those kind of policies. They can be good policies to have in general and help retain a healthy workforce. I do think where we've fallen down is sometimes there, again, the Christian community overall, I don't yet think pro-family policies are part of a holistic definition of a Christian employer. There's a lot of Christian employers who kind of have their faith is part of their identity or part of even their marketing, but pro-family policies are not evident in their workplace, so it's not yet fully part of the definition. There are a couple of denominations that are doing great stuff and moving in a positive direction. The Episcopal Church USA has put together a working group to develop a path to provide paid family leave to those who work in the church, and they're kind of working it out. It's not easy, but they're, hopefully they're working it out through their formal church processes. The Southern Baptist Convention just last week, in its national gathering, passed a resolution around its the church's longtime pro-life stance, and articulated the need in this moment when abortion is the legal status of abortion is likely to change. They've articulated the importance of supporting women and children through both private action and good, just laws. So that kind of movement, I think, is really, really important for churches to emulate, or for those churches who are part of the Southern Baptist tradition. There's kind of a growing explicit articulation of what I would call a whole life approach.
Okay, well, that's encouraging, and thank you for that. Because I think about it's definitely something I've heard as, again, like you mentioned, awaiting the Supreme Court decision, and a lot of the state laws with their ready to go, is it trigger law, whatever, and having passed very restrictive laws in the meantime, that continue to be challenged, and some of them are struck down and some of them are upheld. There's definitely been more talk, I think, in Christian spaces where it isn't generally common to talk about these things, like you're saying, healthcare and family leave and supporting women. And it's hard not to be like, this is something that should have been happening all along. Like, why is it only to prevent abortion that you now think women and children are valuable? But that's obviously not a healthy way to enter into the conversation.
Yeah.
But I think it's helpful as we think about, okay, what if laws don't change the way we think they're going to, or if things are not as, the restrictions don't come the way it seems like they're going to, will these conversations continue? Or is it just this, okay, we want to reduce abortions, but then we care about women and children? I just find that so frustrating. But again, I recognize that's not helpful to enter into the conversation. So I guess I'm roundabouting to my question, or to just I don't know. Yes, I think it's a question. As we enter into these conversations, as we work to have conversation, especially across difference, have you seen ways that it's helpful to, or ways that we can reframe for people who might differ in their opinions with us as we try to gently engage in conversations? That was a very roundabout question, but I think you see where I'm going.
I think it's fair to acknowledge all the feelings that everyone has on all sides. I think that's fair. I think we can't escape them, right? I think we feel strongly, everyone feels strongly about some aspect of this. And I think everyone feels strongly that their voice hasn't been heard in some way. And I also think I do think the way forward is to find that place of potential common ground. And I do think that one of those is to say, how can we value that pregnancy and childbirth is so unique? It is a time when two lives are kind of wrapped up with each other. So how can we support that essential, beautiful thing? We're going to recognize it's difficult, recognize the complexity and some of the very difficult choices that can emerge during that, during pregnancy and childbirth. But were we to simply, begin with that place and say, this matters, this part of life really matters. How do we value it as much as we possibly can? How do we support it? And then try to grow from there. And it's never too late for any of us to try to build something that is beautiful and needed and supportive and just. We can be frustrated that we're the only nation that doesn't have paid leave, and it's taken us forever, and all these things, but we can always start now. And I do think that we should try to approach our relationships as much as possible around the humanness of our interlocutors, and not around our positions, not around the camps that we're in. I did bring, there's something that Marilyn Robinson wrote that's really inspired me around any time I'm kind of faced with a situation where it feels like there's a lot of polarization and kind of everybody involved is just in camps and their kind of their identities rather than humans, rather than persons. Let me see if I can find it because it's been helpful to me. Yes, okay. So she says, so it's kind of the difference between thinking of people who are different than us and putting them in a box, right? Versus allowing them to simply be who they are and show themselves to us, and maybe for God to reveal something to us about them. So this is what Robinson writes. Contempt imposes, grace discovers. Contempt generalizes. Grace is harmed by haunting particularities. Contempt entraps, grace frees. So
Wow. I like that.
I think a lot about that. And I do think our polarization is really driven by a lot of contempt, right? Or it's marked by a lot of contempt. And so this idea that perhaps the opposite of that is grace is very moving to me. So I try to hold on to that.
Yeah. Oh, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I appreciate the articulation there of that, just the way in which we're polarized. I feel like you walked us through that a little bit, and it resonates so much with me because, as I think I mentioned earlier, having sort of still existing, I was born and raised and still attend the church I was born into. So if this very particular faith community that, at times has, a certain ethic around abortion and is very pro-life. I mean, I could do like a Paul's thing about like, my pro-life bona fides when I was in high school, because when I was in high school, it was I forget the organization, but I mean, I held signs and along the road and petitions and all of these things, because this was the issue that sort of defined my high school activism, for lack of a better word. And as we're thinking about these things and the way in which that definitely set me up for an us them. I mean, I was a teenager. It could have been presented to me in a much more nuanced way than I'm remembering it. Just in all fairness.
All of us as teenagers, I mean, as someone who has a preteen, I think all of us as teenagers are inclined towards a lot of certainty.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. But thinking about the way in which that one issue was the thing that I was encouraged to be active for, and to sort of my introduction into political understanding. And I think about all these other policies that we're talking about, the ways in which to support women and support families. And I just lament in a lot of ways that myopic view that didn't teach me at the time. And again, it's possible that someone tried, but the message I got was, this is the issue that matters, and this is what God cares about. And now just pulling back and seeing all of the ways in which we could have been using that very potent political power, frankly, that the evangelical church wields for these supportive policies and these ways in which to just honor the Imago Dei in women and children. And I just lament that. And not the activism. There are people who felt very strongly and faithfully about these things. That's a separate thing. But the way in which we went down the tunnel, for lack of a better word. And so I just appreciate the conversation around talking across differences, but also how do we nuance our own view? Because I think I've gone on a journey. And so that I think that helps me see that other people who maybe to me have like the wrong view, we're all on a journey. So anyway, I just appreciate that framing. And obviously, as I like relearn my own experiences and continue to learn, I mean, these conversations are so helpful. So thinking about that and how we're trying to help Christian communities understand and move forward in these conversations. You've shared some specific policies, and I think that's important for us to be aware of. Have you developed, and do you feel like it's important to have a theology around life that is not necessarily one way, but that informs what we do? I mean, you've talked about some Bible verses that really help you understand family, but I think as we're trying to like have some formation, some Christian formation around this. I'm just thinking about the ways in which our theological views maybe are and are not engaged with this issue, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I've focused more on this theology of family life and, and in truth, I think the theology around life takes an additional set of reflections. But I think I would start with a few things. I would start with an understanding of flourishing and God's desire for humans to flourish. And then from there, the fact that we flourish in relationship to each other. We nurture each other, we grow together. And so anything that we're doing should be in that service, right? In the service of the flourishing of the human person, of the image of God in each person, and the kinds of relationships and even institutions that come around people to help them flourish and grow. Those would be kind of like my bottom lines. And
no, that's incredibly helpful. And it makes me think of sort of like an orientation, like, or a starting point. I'm not sure what metaphor to go with, but just thinking about the way in which we're framing things. And as opposed to, I guess what I'm thinking about is how do we help each other, people we're in Christian community with, come at this from that sort of God posture, thinking about what does God want us to be for, and thinking about flourishing and all of that. So helpful, because I think this issue sometimes is such a label, it's such a political issue that we maybe like separate it out. Like we've been told, okay, this is what you need to think in all the camps.
Yeah.
And therefore, like, it's like, okay, this is the moral thing, or this is the right thing. And we go with that, and we don't filter it through the things we filter other things through if we're believers, right? This, how does God view this? What does God want us to be for? I really appreciate you come back to that so much in different things when we're thinking about family, when we're thinking about life, like, what is it for and what are we doing it for? So I just find that helpful.
I think it's also helpful to have a political theology. And that's particularly because this issue has been politicized in certain ways. It's been politically coded. I don't think that politics is a bad thing, but it's been politically coded and politically polarized in very particular ways. So I do think it's helpful to kind of then take the step back and ask, what is our political engagement for? What does God intend that for? And there I would say that citizenship is part of our stewardship of creation. So God tasks us with the stewardship of creation, and as bearers of the divine image, we steward creation, we help it to grow, just as God did. We love it, just as God did. And then the crazy thing about it is we have to do that together, right? Like all humans are tasked with that, which means we have to do it together, which means we have to learn to collaborate, right? And democracy is an expression of that, and an attempted expression of peaceful collaboration in this task of stewardship. So I think that's helpful to think about, because we might do well to ask ourselves, are we engaged in that stewardship task and that collaborative stewardship task? Or in our political work, have we gotten kind of drawn into something that's much more like winning, or kind of winning a battle and using our political community as instrumental to our own victory? I believe that God does want us to build this sustainable, stewarding political community. And so sometimes that itself has value. But I do worry, right? Sometimes we're about all ready to burn it down in service of bringing a victory to our side. And I don't think that would honor God.
Yeah. Again, that's just really helpful lens or perspective to think about it, because I don't enjoy when we kind of want to section off politics and make it like, oh, this is too political. I think there's an immense amount of privilege in being able to ignore the political. I think there's certain demographics where, sure, life's going to be fine whether I'm an activist or not because of XYZ, but I think political is not a dirty word, but I think you did a great job articulating that. Like this issue in particular has become a label making political issue as opposed to something we wrestle through. And again, as Christian believers trying to usher in that flourishing, we can't avoid that has to be a political act in some form or another. So yeah, I think it is just that framing, the way you articulated that was helpful. Again, it's how we orient ourselves. I just want to share, we did have someone pose a question, and in all fairness, I'm not sure if this is your area of expertise, so I'm just going to pose it and you can tell me how we want to talk about it. Someone just asked about if we know of what the demographics are of women who are generally seeking abortions. So I think they're thinking of like, there might generally be a stereotype of like, this is a form of birth control and this is why it's bad. And then this person was thinking, is it more like young women who have no other way, or is it a spectrum?
So I may not have all of the demographics at my fingertips. I'll name a couple of things. One is it's known that the highest birth rate in the US is among women of kind of lower economic means. That's like for a couple of reasons. One is early in your life, you're more likely to have having children. One could be less established in your work life, haven't moved up the wage ladder yet, but also it just appears like many kids are being born to parents without a lot of means. So having supports like paid family leave will matter a lot to a lot of children, I guess would be one way to put it. There's a lot of kids that are being born that don't have that support right now. In terms of abortion and abortion rates, I don't know all the details. I do know that qualitative studies with women who are contemplating abortion do surface, like at least 70% say that feeling that they're not able to support their child goes into their contemplation of abortion. It's a factor. So that's about 70% to almost 3/4, I think.
Wow. Okay. That is helpful. Thank you. Because again, that just brings us back to these policy discussions where if we really want to have available different choices for people, then it's anti-poverty legislation, it's healthcare. Because that did make me think, as you were saying it, I was like, there's also this whole side issue that now that I bring it up 5 minutes before we're done, access to birth control, right? This is again, one of those things that there seems to be a specific segment of the Christian community who either advocate against or don't support, birth control being covered, for instance, by your employer's healthcare, and some of these really simple things. And, again, I think reasonable, faithful minds can have arguments, but when we think about what actually will prevent people being put in this position to make this choice, I think there's a very common sense argument around availability of birth control.
Yeah, it definitely goes into the importance of healthcare across the lifespan.
Yes, for sure. Okay, well, we are reaching the end of our time. So I just want to ask if there's anything we didn't cover, anything that you feel like would be helpful to kind of move the conversation along. You've done a tremendous job of carving things. So
no, it's been great to talk with you. And I would love to be in touch. I think you'd asked me by email about resources. There are a handful of resources at our website, familiesvalued.org. We have an advocacy toolkit around paid family leave. We've got some book group toolkits for the summer. There's a book called Parent Nation that we were able to recently host that book's author. And so we're encouraging folks to read that book over the summer and think about how is it that parents have been supported or not supported, and how can we change that?
Oh, wow. Okay. That's great. Yeah. We'll make sure that link is in the chat here and then goes up when we put this on YouTube so that people can have that. That's great. I think the more resources people can have, the more learning we can do and connections we can make with people who are trying to work and think through these issues. I think that just builds that collaborative community. So Thank you for the work that you do generally, and thank you for being part of this conversation. I will just say that we're having another conversation with another longtime friend of BFJN, Mako Nagasawa, on June 30th. So definitely join us for that. And it will be the same kind of format here. And with Mako, we'll talk a little bit more about the theology and church history behind the thinking around abortion, just again, to help us work on our lenses and our perspectives so that we can enter in this conversation in a way that's God honoring. And if you're not connected to Boston Faith and Justice, I would encourage you to check out our website and follow us on social media. And if you're so inclined, feel free to donate to the work that we do so we can keep having these conversations. Thank you so much, Rachel. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Take care.
Good night.